The air inside St. Mark's Church was heavy, almost suffocating. The dim glow of votive candles cast flickering shadows on the cold stone walls, and the faint aroma of incense clung to every corner. I sat in the back pew, far from the pulpit, my hands folded as if in prayer, though my mind was far from spiritual devotion. The organ hummed softly, a prelude to the evening mass, but I wasn't here for worship. No, tonight I was here for something darker, something that had been festering in my soul for weeks. The irony wasn't lost on me, sitting in this sanctuary, where vows were made and sins were confessed, while the truth I sought felt blasphemous. My wife, Sophie, was somewhere in this very building. Not alone. I could feel it in my gut. Something was off, something that twisted the sanctity of this place into a theater of betrayal. Father Donovan was a man of the cloth, respected and revered in our community. He had baptized my son, blessed my home, and guided us through the darker days of our marriage. He preached of loyalty, of devotion, and yet. A creak echoed through the nave as someone entered a side door, and my heart skipped a beat. From where I sat, I had a view of the vestry. My stomach churned as I saw Sophie slip through the door, glancing back nervously before it closed behind her. She didn't see me. She wasn't supposed to. The organ swelled, and parishioners began trickling in. But my focus was elsewhere. The vestry. The silence that followed. And the sickening suspicion that was slowly becoming certainty. What was Sophie doing? And why did it feel like the faith we shared had become a shield for something unholy? I couldn't leave without answers. Not this time. I waited for the pews to fill, my heart pounding in my chest. The faithful murmured prayers, their hands gliding over rosary beads. The choir's soft harmonies echoed through the church, but they barely registered. My eyes were glued to the vestry door. Sophie's sudden appearance wasn't the first sign. The whispers in the community, the late nights she claimed were the volunteer meetings, her newfound devotion to church activities, it all painted a picture I refused to see until now. I trusted her. I trusted him. Father Donovan was more than a priest to us. He was a friend, a confidant. Yet here I was, seated in the shadows, watching, doubting, and waiting. A heavy silence fell as the congregation stood for the opening hymn. I rose with them, my legs trembling. My mind spun with questions, none of which I wanted answered. Sophie wouldn't. Father Donovan couldn't. And yet, the answers were on the other side of that door. As the hymn swelled, I made my move. Quietly slipping out of the pew, I stepped toward the side of the church, my footsteps swallowed by the choir's voices. No one noticed as I edged along the stone walls, staying out of sight. I reached the vestry door, the polished wood warm beneath my hand. My breath hitched. Was I ready for what lay beyond? Could I even handle it? The voices of the choir reached a crescendo, moment of divine beauty that seemed almost mocking. I swallowed hard and pushed the door open a crack. My heart froze at what I saw. There they were. Sophie's back was to me, her head bowed, her hands clasped in Father Donovan's. They stood close, too close. His voice was low, inaudible over the hymn, but his face. His face held something I couldn't name. Sympathy. Guilt. Desire. I didn't move. Couldn't breathe. My mind scrambled for explanations, but none fit. This was beyond anything I could imagine. The hymn ended abruptly, and the church fell silent. For a split second, Sophie turned her head as if sensing my presence. I let the door close softly, retreating into the shadows once more. The service began, the priest's booming voice calling the congregation to prayer. But Father Donovan wasn't at the altar. He was still behind that door, with my wife. I slipped back into the pews, my body trembling. The service unfolded around me like a strange, distant dream. The parishioners knelt, murmuring their prayers, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. I stayed seated, my gaze fixed on the vestry door, my thoughts a chaotic blur. Minutes passed like hours. Father Donovan finally emerged, his robes flowing as he approached the altar with practiced grace. Sophie didn't follow. My heart pounded as the priest began his sermon, speaking of redemption and the strength to overcome temptation. His voice was steady, his words flawless. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that he was trembling inside. A sudden clatter shattered the stillness. Father Donovan flinched, his hands instinctively reaching down. Something had slipped from his grip, a small silver object now spinning on the marble floor. The congregation gasped, and the priest hesitated for a heartbeat before bending to retrieve it. A key. It wasn't the kind of ornate key used in church rituals. No, this was a simple house key, unremarkable except for the blue tag dangling from it. My stomach dropped as recognition slammed into me like a tidal wave. That was my house key. My head swam. How did Father Donovan have it? Why was it with him here, in this place? I gripped the edge of the pew, my knuckles white. Father Donovan's hand trembled as he picked it up, his face briefly betraying a flicker of panic before he tucked the key into his robe. He continued his sermon, but the words felt hollow now, his voice losing its commanding timbre. No one else seemed to notice the weight of the moment, but I did. My mind raced, piecing together fragments of suspicion into an undeniable truth. The key. Sophie's sudden devotions. Donovan's hesitation. This wasn't mere coincidence. It was confirmation. I barely heard the rest of the service. My hands itched to confront him, to demand answers, but I waited. The moment wasn't right, not yet. I needed more than suspicion. I needed the whole truth. And the truth, I knew, was still waiting for me behind the vestry door. The service ended with a solemn blessing. Parishioners murmured their amens, shook hands, and began filing out of the church. I stayed seated, my heart pounding as I watched Father Donovan disappear into the sacristy, his movements hurried, almost frantic. Sophie was nowhere in sight. The congregation thinned until only a few stragglers remained, lighting candles, or lingering in quiet prayer. The weight of the key, my key, in Donovan's possession burned in my mind. I waited, timing my steps carefully, pretending to be another pious soul lost in contemplation. When the last of the parishioners left, I rose and moved toward the vestry door. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing the small, dimly lit room beyond. It smelled of old wood and faint incense. Rows of robes hung neatly along one wall, and a large wooden table was cluttered with books and candles. At first glance, the room seemed empty. Sophie. I called softly, my voice barely audible. No answer. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. The air felt heavier here, oppressive. A faint sound drew my attention, a whisper, barely there, coming from beyond the second door that led to the priest's private office. My pulse quickened as I approached, every step a battle against the part of me that wanted to turn back, to unsee whatever truth lay ahead. I reached for the door, but it opened before I could touch it. Sophie stood there, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. Mark. Her voice was a broken whisper, thick with panic. I stared at her, at the rumpled edge of her blouse, the disheveled way her hair fell over her shoulder. She stepped forward, trying to block the view of the room behind her, but I caught a glimpse, Father Donovan standing near his desk, his hands gripping the edge as if to steady himself. What's going on? My voice was low, but the fury underneath was unmistakable. Nothing, Sophie stammered, reaching for my arm. Let's go. We need to talk at home. Why does he have my house key? I demanded, my eyes locked on Donovan. The priest straightened, his face composed, though a bead of sweat glistened on his temple. He began, but his words faltered as I stepped past Sophie, closing the distance between us. Explain, I growled, my voice trembling with barely contained rage. It's not what you think, Donovan said finally, his voice calm, practiced. But his hands betrayed him, fidgeting nervously. What I think, I said, my words deliberate, is that my wife has been lying to me. That you, someone I trusted, have been lying to me. Mark, stop, Sophie pleaded, grabbing my arm again. It's not like that. I can explain. Explain, then. I shouted, my voice reverberating off the stone walls. Sophie recoiled, and Donovan stepped forward, his hands raised as if to calm me. Please, lower your voice. This is a house of God. A house of God. I spat. Don't you dare preach to me about sanctity when you're hiding behind your collar. For a moment, silence filled the room. Donovan looked at Sophie, and then at me, as though weighing his next words carefully. Finally, he spoke. Sophie came to me for guidance, he said, his voice steady but his eyes refusing to meet mine. She was struggling, feeling lost. I offered her counsel, a safe space to speak openly. And my house key? I demanded, my hand clenching into a fist. That, Donovan hesitated, glancing at Sophie again. She looked away, biting her lip. Mark, Sophie said softly, I gave him the key. Her words hit me like a blow. You, what? Why? I needed someone to talk to. Someone who wouldn't judge me, she said, tears brimming in her eyes. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Like what? My voice broke, the weight of her betrayal threatening to crush me. Donovan took a deep breath, his composure cracking. Sophie has been, confiding in me, he admitted. About your marriage, your struggles. I only wanted to help. Help. I stepped closer to him, my anger boiling over. You call this helping? Mark, stop, Sophie cried. It wasn't supposed to go this far. Her words hung in the air, and the room fell into an unbearable silence. I turned to her, my voice cold. How far did it go, Sophie? She didn't answer. Her silence was enough. You betrayed me, I said, my voice trembling. In the one place I thought was sacred. I turned to Donovan, my fury barely restrained. And you, how dare you stand there in your robes and pretend to be a man of God? You've defiled everything you claimed to believe in. I'm sorry, Donovan whispered, his shoulders slumping. But the apology was hollow, a flimsy shield against the truth that now lay bare between us. I took a step back, shaking my head. The weight of it all, the lies, the betrayal, the mockery of my trust, was suffocating. Without another word, I turned and walked out, the door slamming shut behind me. Outside, the night air was cool, but it did nothing to ease the fire raging inside me. My mind raced as I tried to piece together what came next. One thing was certain, would never look at Sophie, or this church, the same way again. I drove aimlessly through the darkened streets, the cold reality of the evening crashing over me in waves. My mind reeled, replaying Sophie's trembling voice and Father Donovan's pitiful excuses. The betrayal felt surreal, as though it belonged to someone else's life, not mine. I pulled into a secluded park and killed the engine. The silence was deafening. For a while, I just sat there, staring at my hands, gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only thing tethering me to sanity. Sophie and I had built a life together, a marriage founded on trust, on love, on the promise that we would face life's challenges as one. And now, that foundation felt as though it had been razed to the ground, the rubble mocking every choice I had made to protect what I thought we had. The priest. The image of Father Donovan's pale face flashed in my mind, his words ringing hollow. He was supposed to be a moral guide, a man above reproach, yet he had crossed a line that should have never even existed. And Sophie, her silence, her refusal to explain the depth of what had happened, was a betrayal that cut even deeper. I pulled out my phone and stared at her name on the screen. The thought of confronting her again felt like opening a wound that was already bleeding out. Yet the need for answers was suffocating. Before I could press call, the phone buzzed in my hand. It was her. "Mark," she said, her voice fragile. "Please, come home. Let's talk. I can't leave things like this." My grip on the phone tightened. "Why should I? You've already made your choices, Sophie. What else is there to say?" "I was confused," she said, her voice breaking. "I never meant for this to happen. It wasn't what you think, it wasn't physical. It was. It was what?" I snapped, my anger bubbling to the surface. "Emotional. Spiritual. You gave a man my house key, Sophie. Do you understand how insane that is?" "I thought I could trust him," she said, her words stumbling over themselves. "He listened to me when I needed someone. You've been so distant lately, and I—" "Don't you dare blame this on me," I interrupted, my voice ice. "I've been nothing but faithful to you, Sophie. You, on the other hand—" "I didn't sleep with him," she blurted, desperation in her tone. The words hung in the air, a strange mix of relief and suspicion. "But you wanted to," I said quietly. There was a long pause. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. "I don't know." It felt like a punch to the gut. The honesty I had always loved in her was now a dagger aimed straight at my heart. "I'll come home," I said after a moment, my tone cold. "But not for you, for the kids. We need to talk about what happens next. This can't be fixed, Sophie." She began to cry, but I ended the call, the sound of her sobs like salt on an open wound. When I arrived home, the house was dark except for the glow of the porch light. Sophie was waiting in the living room, her face drawn and pale. She stood as I entered, but I walked past her, my gaze fixed on the framed photos on the mantel, our wedding day, the kids at the beach, a family portrait from last Christmas. "How did we end up here?" I murmured, more to myself than to her. "Mark," she said softly, taking a hesitant step toward me. "Please, let me explain." I turned to face her, my eyes filled with a cold fury. "Explain what?" "That you betrayed me in the one place I thought was untouchable. That you turned to him instead of me." Tears streamed down her cheeks, but I felt no sympathy. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she whispered. I needed someone to tell me I was still worthy." "Worthy of what?" I snapped. "Of love? Of respect? Sophie, I've given you everything. And this is how you repay me?" Her silence spoke volumes. "I'll sleep in the guest room," I said finally. "Tomorrow, we figure out how to tell the kids." After that, I trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. She nodded, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs as I turned and left the room. Upstairs, the guest room was cold and unfamiliar, a stark reminder of how far apart we had drifted. As I lay staring at the ceiling, a single, chilling thought crystallized in my mind. It wasn't over. Not yet. Father Donovan wasn't just some man. He was a man of the cloth, someone entrusted with the spiritual well-being of an entire congregation. And he had abused that trust in the most personal, unforgivable way. By morning, I knew what I had to do. This wasn't just about my marriage anymore. This was about justice. The morning sunlight filtered through the guest room curtains, weak and pale, as though it too was unsure about shining on the wreckage of my life. I hadn't slept, my mind consumed with the fragments of Sophie's confession and the weight of Father Donovan's betrayal. The anger hadn't subsided, if anything, it had hardened into resolve. I left the house before Sophie or the kids stirred, slipping out with a quiet determination. My destination was clear. St. Mark's stood silent and imposing as I approached, the early hour leaving the church empty except for the faint hum of life within. A custodian greeted me with a polite nod as I stepped inside, his broom scratching softly against the stone floor. "Is Father Donovan here?" I asked, my voice clipped. He hesitated, eyeing me cautiously. He's in the confessional, preparing for the morning sessions. Perfect. The confessional booth loomed ahead, its wooden structure both inviting and foreboding. I crossed the nave, my footsteps echoing against the vaulted ceiling. The church felt cavernous, a sacred emptiness pressing down on me as I pushed open the door to the booth and slipped inside. I knelt, the partition between us a thin veil separating sinner from absolver. "Father?" I said, my voice low. There was a pause before he answered, his voice as steady as ever. "Yes, my child. How can I help you?" For a moment, I said nothing, letting the weight of the silence press into the narrow space between us. Then I spoke, my words sharp as a blade. "I'm here to confess a sin, Father. But I think you already know what it is." Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, his tone was careful, measured. "I'm not sure I understand. Please, tell me what troubles you." "What troubles me," I said, leaning closer to the partition, "is the man I trusted with my family. The man who took my wife's confessions and twisted them into something they were never meant to be." I heard his sharp intake of breath. "Mark," he said, abandoning the formalities. "This isn't the place." "This is exactly the place," I interrupted, my voice rising. "This is where you made your vows, isn't it? To God? To your congregation? To live above reproach? And yet here we are." He said nothing, and the weight of his silence confirmed everything. "Why?" I demanded, my voice breaking. "Why her? Why my wife?" "I never meant to hurt you," he said finally, his voice heavy with something that might have been regret. "Or her. She came to me for guidance, and it got complicated." "Complicated?" I repeated, my anger flaring. "You abused her trust. You abused mine. You've defiled this church and everything it stands for." "I didn't touch her," he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I swear to you, Mark, it never went that far." "Then what? What did you do? What do you call stealing her emotions, her devotion, her loyalty? You might as well have touched her because the damage is the same." He didn't answer, the silence thickening around us like a shroud. I leaned back, my fists clenched. "You're going to stand in that pulpit today and deliver a sermon about virtue, about faith, about love. And every word will be a lie." "Please," he said softly, his voice almost pleading. "I made a mistake, a terrible mistake. But I didn't break my vows. I only wanted to help her, to help you both." "Help?" I hissed. "You wanted her. Admit it." Another silence, longer this time, before he whispered, "I don't know." The words gutted me, their simplicity more damning than any confession could have been. I stood abruptly, my breath ragged. "You're unworthy of this place, of this collar. I don't know what I'll do yet, but you're going to answer for what you've done. To me. To her. To this congregation. Mark, please." But I was already out the door, the sound of his voice swallowed by the vast emptiness of the church. As I stepped outside into the bright morning, the weight of my anger lifted slightly, replaced by a grim certainty. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I drove back to the house, my mind racing. Sophie greeted me in the kitchen, her eyes swollen from crying. The kids were in the living room, their laughter a stark contrast to the tension hanging between us. "Did you see him?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling. "I did," I replied, my tone flat. "And he confirmed what I already knew. Maybe he didn't touch you, Sophie, but what you shared with him, your thoughts, your emotions, wasn't innocent." She looked down, her hands gripping the counter. "I never wanted to hurt you." "But you did," I said, my voice firm. "And now we have to figure out what happens next, for us, for the kids, for everything." Her tears began to fall again, but I turned away, unable to watch. My resolve was hardening, my focus shifting. This wasn't just a betrayal of our marriage. It was a betrayal of everything I held sacred. Father Donovan had made a mockery of his position, and Sophie's complicity only deepened the wound. But one thing was clear, neither of them would walk away from this unscathed. That evening, I returned to St. Mark's. The church stood in solemn silence, bathed in the cool glow of twilight. Its towering spire reached toward the heavens, a stark contrast to the turmoil churning in my heart. The irony of seeking closure in the very place where my life had begun to unravel was not lost on me. The doors opened with a groan, the sound reverberating through the empty nave. I stepped inside, the familiar scent of incense filling my lungs. Candles flickered on the altar, their flames casting long shadows on the walls. The pews were empty, the church a hollow echo of its usual vitality. Ahead, Father Donovan stood near the altar, arranging a stack of papers. His back was to me, but as the heavy thud of the door announced my arrival, he turned. His expression shifted instantly, the calm mask of priestly authority replaced by something raw, apprehension, perhaps even fear. "Mark," he said, his voice breaking the silence. "I didn't expect to see you again tonight." "Didn't you?" I replied, my tone sharp. "You thought I'd let this go? That I'd sit at home, pretend this never happened, and just move on?" He set the papers down carefully, his hands trembling. "I told you the truth earlier," he said, stepping down from the altar. "I know I've hurt you. I've hurt your family. But you must believe me, I never intended for this to happen." "You never intended?" I barked, taking a step closer. "You intended every word, every moment. You knew what you were doing the second you let Sophie confide in you. Don't insult me by pretending otherwise." He lowered his gaze, his face pale under the dim light. "It wasn't like that," he said softly. "I was trying to help her, to guide her through her struggles." "To guide her?" I hissed. "You didn't guide her, you led her straight into ruin. You exploited her vulnerability. You exploited our trust. Do you even understand what you've done?" His shoulders slumped, his composure cracking under the weight of my words. "I failed," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I failed you, your wife, and the church. I allowed my own weaknesses to cloud my judgment. For that, I am deeply sorry." "Sorry?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Sorry doesn't even begin to cover it. You were supposed to be a man of God, a beacon of morality. Instead, you're nothing but a fraud, a man who hides behind his collar while tearing apart the lives of the people who trusted him." He flinched, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "You're right," he said after a long pause. "I have no defense for my actions. But I swear to you, Mark, I never touched her. I never let it go that far." I laughed bitterly, the sound echoing through the empty church. "Far? It doesn't matter how far it went. What you did, the intimacy, the connection, the lies, is just as damaging. You've broken something sacred, and there's no fixing it." Donovan looked away, his face etched with regret. "I'll step down," he said quietly. "I'll speak to the bishop and resign from my position. I'll leave this parish and accept whatever consequences come my way." "And that's supposed to make it better?" I asked, my anger flaring again. "You think leaving will undo the damage? You think walking away erases what you've done to me, to Sophie, to this church?" "No," he admitted, his voice trembling. "But it's all I can do. I've failed as a priest, and I have no right to continue serving." I took a step closer, my fists clenched at my sides. "You think this ends here? You think you can just run and leave me to pick up the pieces? You don't get to walk away unscathed, Father. Not this time." He met my gaze, his eyes filled with shame. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "I don't deserve it. But please, for your sake, for Sophie's, don't let this consume you." "Consume me?" I repeated, my voice laced with bitterness. It already has. And you're going to answer for it, not just to me, but to everyone you've betrayed. For a moment, the silence between us was deafening, the weight of our words settling heavily in the sacred space. Finally, I turned, my footsteps echoing as I made my way toward the doors. At the threshold, I paused and looked back. Father Donovan stood alone, a broken figure against the grandeur of the altar. Whatever authority he once commanded had crumbled, leaving behind a man stripped of his illusions. You don't deserve this church, I said, my voice steady. And you certainly don't deserve the forgiveness you preach. With that, I pushed open the doors and stepped into the cool night air. The church behind me was no longer a sanctuary. It was a monument to everything I had lost, and everything I would never regain. But for the first time, I felt a sliver of control return. Justice wouldn't erase the pain, but it was a start.